The house of Blackwood stood upon a rise of ancient stone, its towers piercing the pale morning mist like solemn sentinels guarding centuries of pride. Beneath a sky washed silver by the first light of dawn, the great manor appeared magnificent to any traveler fortunate enough to glimpse it from afar. Yet beauty often concealed cruelty, and within those gilded walls a young woman knelt upon a cold marble floor, learning how little splendor could protect a wounded heart. The grand entrance hall shimmered with wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead like frozen constellations. Gold-trimmed portraits watched from paneled walls. Polished mirrors reflected endless corridors lined with priceless vases and carved mahogany tables. The manor breathed privilege in every detail. Yet at its center, dressed not as a duchess but as a servant, Lady Eleanor Blackwood scrubbed the floor with trembling hands. A bucket of cloudy water rested beside her. The hem of her cream-colored gown was damp and stained. Strands of chestnut hair had escaped the careful arrangement expected of a noblewoman, clinging to her flushed cheeks. Each movement sent an ache through her shoulders, yet she continued her task without complaint. In the silence, only the soft scrape of cloth against marble disturbed the morning stillness. The servants passing through the hall lowered their eyes. Some pitied her. Others feared being seen showing pity. No one dared intervene. Eleanor had been Duchess of Blackwood for nearly 8 months, yet the title felt increasingly like a beautiful prison. She had entered the manor with modest hopes and a heart still capable of believing in kindness. Raised by a widowed father whose fortunes had dwindled but whose principles remained intact, she had learned dignity before luxury, compassion before ambition. Such virtues had earned admiration in smaller circles. Inside Blackwood Manor they earned little more than contempt. The source of that contempt descended the staircase precisely as the grandfather clock announced 7. Dowager Duchess Beatrice Blackwood moved with the authority of a reigning monarch rather than a retired matriarch. Her dark velvet gown swept behind her like a shadow. Diamonds flashed at her throat. Though age had touched her features, it had not diminished the force of her presence. Conversations ceased when she entered rooms. Servants stiffened. Guests adjusted their posture. Even silence seemed to obey her. Her sharp gaze settled upon Eleanor. Disapproval immediately hardened her expression. "How leisurely you worked this morning," she remarked. Eleanor rose carefully to her feet. "I apologize if I have disappointed you, Your Grace." "Disappointed?" Beatrice echoed. "My expectations were never high enough for disappointment." The words landed with practiced precision. Several servants nearby exchanged uneasy glances. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks but lowered her eyes respectfully. She had learned that defense only invited harsher attacks. The Dowager Duchess slowly approached. "You arrive from a family burdened by debt. You receive one of the greatest names in England. You are given a title women would envy. Yet I find you lacking in nearly every quality expected of a Blackwood." The hall seemed smaller with every sentence. Eleanor clasped her hands tightly to hide their trembling. "I strive each day to improve." "A servant strives," Beatrice replied coldly. "A duchess succeeds." The sting of humiliation settled deeper. Still Eleanor remained silent. That silence only encouraged the older woman further. By now several visiting ladies had entered the hall, gathering near the staircase. Their curiosity flickered behind polite smiles. They understood exactly what was unfolding and lingered to watch. Beatrice noticed them. Her eyes gleamed. An audience transformed cruelty into performance. She turned toward the guests before addressing Eleanor loudly enough for every corner of the hall to hear. "Perhaps someone should remind you why you were chosen." The marble floor suddenly felt unsteady beneath Eleanor's feet. A dreadful instinct warned her what was coming. Beatrice stepped closer. "You were not brought into this house for affection, child." The guests listened. The servants froze. Even the chandeliers seemed suspended in anticipation. "You are here for work," Beatrice continued, her voice cutting through the hall like a blade, "and an heir." The words echoed mercilessly. For one terrible moment, Eleanor could not breathe. Every private fear she had carried since her marriage now stood exposed before strangers. Not a wife. Not a companion. Not a woman worthy of love. Merely a duty wrapped in silk. A few ladies lowered their gaze, embarrassed by the spectacle. Others appeared fascinated. Eleanor swallowed the ache rising in her throat. She refused to cry. Not here. Not before them. Not before the woman determined to break her. With painstaking composure, she lowered her head and whispered, "Yes, Your Grace." The answer seemed to satisfy Beatrice. The Dowager Duchess turned away, already victorious. Yet as she departed, Unaware of another presence concealed beyond the partially open doorway leading toward the west corridor, the balance of the morning shifted. A tall figure stood motionless within the shadows. Duke Alexander Blackwood had heard every word. The heir to one of England's most powerful houses remained hidden from view, his expression unreadable save for the dangerous tightening of his jaw. His dark eyes followed the sight of his wife kneeling once more upon the marble floor, and for the first time since their marriage, silence no longer felt like obedience. It felt like guilt. The days that followed settled over Blackwood Manor like a lingering winter fog, cold enough to numb but never cold enough to forget. Life resumed its rigid rhythm. Servants polished silver. Carriages arrived and departed. Fires crackled behind marble hearths. Yet for Eleanor Blackwood, every morning carried the echo of a single sentence she could not silence. "You are here for work and an heir." The words haunted quiet moments. They accompanied her through endless corridors and shadowed her reflection in every mirror. Though she continued to perform her duties with grace, something fragile had fractured within her. She smiled when required. She answered politely. She endured. Yet the hope she had once brought into the marriage seemed to withdraw further each day. Duke Alexander remained an equally painful mystery. Since the humiliation in the entrance hall, she had sensed his gaze more often than before. Sometimes she would look up during dinner and find his dark eyes resting upon her for a brief moment before turning away. At other times she would glimpse him across a corridor, standing motionless as though burdened by thoughts he could not voice. He never spoke of what had happened. Neither did she. Their silence grew heavier with every passing day. Then one morning something unexpected appeared. A single white rose rested outside Eleanor's chamber door. Its petals were flawless. Fresh dew still clung to the delicate bloom. There was no note. No servant claimed responsibility. No explanation accompanied the gift. Eleanor turned the flower carefully between her fingers. White roses symbolized sincerity, devotion, and beginnings. She knew the language of flowers well enough to understand the sentiment, yet she could not imagine who had sent it. The mystery lingered throughout the day. The following morning brought another surprise. A beautifully bound volume of poetry sat upon a small table near her favorite window seat. The leather cover bore intricate gold embossing. Inside were verses from poets she had adored as a girl. Again no card. Again no name. The pattern continued. When the weather grew bitterly cold, a luxurious silk shawl appeared in her sitting room before breakfast. When she mentioned missing a particular tea blend from her childhood home, the same tea arrived in the manor kitchens 2 days later. Even the flowers decorating her chamber gradually changed to her preferred varieties without any request on her part. Someone was paying attention. Someone was listening. The realization stirred emotions she had not felt in months. Yet uncertainty accompanied every gift. The more kindness appeared, the more impossible its source seemed. Surely it could not be Alexander. The Duke remained distant, reserved, controlled. A man trained from childhood to conceal every vulnerable thought. And yet she found herself wondering. The servants noticed the changes as well. Whispers traveled swiftly through the household. Footmen exchanged theories. Maids shared speculation behind closed doors. No secret remained hidden long inside a great house. Before long, curiosity extended beyond the manor walls. The winter social season arrived, carrying London's elite into the countryside for a series of lavish gatherings. Invitations flooded Blackwood Manor. Guests arrived daily. Conversations sparkled with gossip. Rumors multiplied. Among those rumors was one particularly persistent question. Why was the Duke suddenly showing interest in his neglected Duchess? The question reached ears eager to exploit it. One snowy evening Blackwood Manor hosted its grandest event of the season. Hundreds of candles illuminated the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across polished floors. Musicians filled the air with elegant waltzes. Silk gowns shimmered like flowing rivers of color. Jewels flashed beneath the glow of candlelight. The gathering represented everything Victorian society valued: status, wealth, appearances, and influence. Eleanor entered on Alexander's arm. Gasps quietly followed. Not because she looked improper. Quite the opposite. Her pale silver gown complemented her beauty perfectly. Months of hardship had not diminished her grace. If anything, suffering had refined it into something unforgettable. Yet admiration quickly gave way to whispers. Several noblewomen watched her with thinly veiled amusement. One particularly outspoken countess smiled sweetly before delivering her cruelty. "How fortunate you are, Duchess," she remarked. Most women prefer husbands who notice them before the wedding rather than afterward. Soft laughter followed. Another lady added, though perhaps his grace simply remembered he possesses a wife. More laughter. The comments were subtle enough to preserve manners, sharp enough to wound. Eleanor felt the familiar sting of humiliation. Across the ballroom, Alexander heard every word. His expression darkened. The orchestra began another waltz. Couples moved toward the dance floor. Conversation resumed. Yet something had changed. Without warning, Alexander crossed the crowded room. Guests stepped aside instinctively. The Duke rarely acted impulsively. When he moved with purpose, people noticed. Eleanor looked up in surprise as he stopped before her. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. He offered his gloved hand. His voice carried clearly through the surrounding silence. "This dance belongs to my wife." No one spoke. No one moved. The declaration echoed louder than any raised voice. Shock rippled through the assembled nobility. The women who had mocked Eleanor moments earlier suddenly found themselves speechless. Alexander ignored them completely. His attention remained fixed upon Eleanor. For one suspended moment, she simply stared. Then she placed her hand in his. The orchestra continued. They stepped onto the floor. As the dance carried them among swirling gowns and polished boots, neither spoke immediately. The distance between them felt charged with unspoken truths. His hand rested firmly at her waist. Hers trembled lightly against his shoulder. "You needn't have done that," she whispered. "Yes," he replied quietly. "I did." The answer lingered between them. Simple. Certain. Dangerously meaningful. For the remainder of the dance, society watched in astonishment. When the final note faded, Alexander escorted her from the ballroom with a courtesy that seemed almost intimate. Only later that night, alone in her chamber, did Eleanor discover one final surprise. Inside the poetry volume lay a folded card she had never noticed before. Her pulse quickened. With careful fingers she opened it. A single sentence had been written in elegant handwriting. Kindness should never have to beg for permission. The words struck her harder than any declaration. Slowly, she turned toward the fireplace where earlier that evening she had noticed the Duke removing his gloves. Upon his wrist had gleamed the Blackwood crest engraved upon a signet cufflink. The same crest embossed upon every mysterious gift. For the first time since her marriage began, Eleanor no longer wondered who had been watching her suffering. She knew. The far more frightening question was why. After the winter ball, Blackwood Manor seemed altered in ways Eleanor could neither explain nor ignore. The same corridors stretched beneath the same portraits. The same servants carried trays through the same candlelit passages. Yet something invisible had shifted, as though a locked door somewhere within the great house had been opened a fraction wider. For the first time since her marriage, uncertainty no longer centered upon whether her husband noticed her. The evidence of his attention had become impossible to deny. The true mystery now lay in understanding the man behind it. Alexander Blackwood remained frustratingly elusive. Days passed without meaningful conversation. At breakfast he sat across from her, composed and unreadable. At dinner he spoke only when etiquette required it. Yet beneath his restraint lingered signs she had previously overlooked. A chair was always placed near the warmest part of a room before her arrival. Her favorite flowers continued appearing throughout the manor. Whenever guests grew unkind, Alexander somehow interrupted the conversation before cruelty could fully bloom. These gestures were small. They were also impossible to dismiss. The realization unsettled Eleanor more than indifference ever had. For indifference required nothing from her heart. Hope demanded everything. One afternoon she stood alone within the manor library, a vast chamber lined with towering shelves and illuminated by pale winter sunlight filtering through leaded windows. Dust motes drifted through the air like tiny stars. She selected a volume from a shelf only to discover another book already resting upon the reading table. A collection of poetry. Inside she found a pressed white rose. No note accompanied it. No explanation. Yet her fingertips lingered against the fragile petals. A smile touched her lips before she could stop it. The expression vanished just as quickly. She hated how much the mystery affected her. She hated how much she wanted it to mean something. Across the room, unnoticed by her, Alexander had entered through a side doorway. He watched silently. Noticing the brief smile, he felt an unfamiliar ache settle in his chest. 4 years' duty had governed every aspect of his life. Duty dictated his education. Duty shaped his future. Duty determined his marriage. The concept of personal happiness had always seemed secondary, almost selfish. His mother had ensured that belief took root early. Beatrice Blackwood raised her son with relentless precision. Affection was rare. Expectations were constant. Mistakes received criticism. Success merely raised the standard higher. Every lesson centered upon preserving the family name. Every conversation emphasized responsibility over feeling. Alexander learned to conceal weakness before he learned to express joy. As a result, silence became his safest language. Now he was beginning to understand the damage that silence could inflict upon others, especially Eleanor. The awareness followed him relentlessly. It accompanied him through estate meetings. It lingered during sleepless nights. It haunted every memory of his wife kneeling on marble floors while he stood motionless in the shadows. The weight of regret grew heavier with each passing day. Then the storm arrived. Dark clouds gathered over the countryside without warning. By late afternoon, powerful winds rattled windows throughout the manor. Rain lashed against the stone walls. Bare tree branches twisted violently beneath a charcoal sky. Eleanor had ventured into the formal gardens shortly before the weather turned. By the time she realized the danger, the storm had already engulfed the estate. Sheets of rain transformed pathways into rivers of mud. Thunder rolled across the landscape. Seeking shelter, she hurried toward an old glass pavilion situated near the far edge of the gardens. The structure offered temporary protection. Nothing more. Wind howled through gaps in the aging framework. Rain hammered against the glass ceiling. Lightning illuminated the surrounding grounds in brief, ghostly flashes. Alone inside the pavilion, Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself and waited. Minutes stretched endlessly. Then she heard hoofbeats. A powerful black horse emerged through the rain. Its rider dismounted before the animal had fully stopped moving. Alexander. Water soaked his dark coat. His hair clung to his forehead. Concern burned openly in his eyes. Not hidden. Not restrained. Open. The sight startled her more than the storm itself. "You should not have come," she said as he entered the pavilion. "I disagree." The simple answer carried unexpected warmth. For a moment neither spoke. Rain drummed against the glass. Thunder echoed overhead. The isolation of the pavilion seemed to separate them from the rest of the world. No servants. No guests. No expectations. Only two people standing amid the storm. Eleanor gathered her courage. "Why?" she asked quietly. Alexander frowned slightly. "Why what?" "The gifts. The protection. The dance." His gaze lowered briefly. When he looked back at her, there was no escape left in his expression. "Because I noticed." The answer pierced straight through her defenses. She stared at him. "You noticed long before the ball." "Yes." "Long before the gifts." A shadow crossed his face. "Yes." Pain flickered through her eyes. "Then why did you never stop it?" The question hung between them. Alexander seemed unable to answer immediately. Years of conditioning battled against honesty. Years of silence resisted confession. Finally he exhaled. "Because I believed endurance was strength." Rain battered the glass harder. His voice remained steady. "My mother taught me that duty required sacrifice. I convinced myself you understood that truth as I did. You watched me suffer." The accusation was gentle. That somehow made it worse. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. "When I saw your tears in the entrance hall, I realized something I should have understood much sooner." His gaze met hers again. A man need not raise his hand to wound someone. Sometimes he need only remain silent. The words carried no excuse. Only regret. For the first time, Eleanor saw beyond the title, beyond the reserve, beyond the distant Duke society believed it knew. She saw a lonely man burdened by mistakes he could no longer justify. And Alexander saw something equally dangerous. Forgiveness. Not complete. Not immediate. But possible. Slowly, almost unconsciously, their hands found one another. Neither pulled away. The storm continued raging beyond the pavilion walls, yet the silence between them felt transformed. What had once been cold now carried fragile understanding. What had once been distance now carried possibility. When the rain finally weakened, they began the journey back toward the manor together. Yet as Blackwood House emerged through the fading storm, illuminated by lantern light against the darkening sky, both halted. A solitary figure stood waiting at the entrance. Dowager Duchess Beatrice Blackwood. And judging by the fury burning in her eyes, she knew exactly where they had been. The journey back to Blackwood Manor unfolded beneath a sky still bruised by the departing storm. Rainwater glistened upon the stone pathways, reflecting the lanterns that flickered beside the entrance. Eleanor walked beside Alexander in silence, Yet the silence between them no longer felt cold. It felt fragile, uncertain, and newly alive. The confession they had shared within the pavilion lingered in every glance and every unspoken thought. For the first time since their marriage, neither could retreat behind the comfortable distance that had once defined their relationship. Waiting at the top of the manor steps stood Dowager Duchess Beatrice Blackwood. The sight of her instantly tightened the atmosphere. She remained perfectly still, her dark cloak moving slightly in the evening wind. The golden light from the entrance hall illuminated her face just enough to reveal the fury burning behind her composed expression. She looked not merely displeased but betrayed. Her gaze moved from Eleanor to Alexander, then back again. No greeting followed. No courtesy. Only judgment. "I see my concerns were justified," she said coldly. Alexander stepped slightly forward. What concerns would those be? The concerns of a mother watching her son abandon reason. Eleanor immediately sensed danger. This was no longer about propriety. This was about control. Beatrice descended the steps with measured elegance. "For months," she continued, "you have neglected matters requiring your attention. Estate affairs are delayed. Invitations remain unanswered. Society has begun to notice your growing fixation." Alexander's jaw tightened. "My wife is not a fixation." The reply arrived instantly. Without hesitation. Without apology. Beatrice seemed startled by the firmness of his voice. For years her son had responded with obedience, silence, or careful diplomacy. This was different. This was resistance. The realization only deepened her anger. "You forget yourself." "No," Alexander replied quietly. "I believe I am remembering myself." For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across Beatrice's face. Then it vanished. "You were raised to protect this family." "I am doing exactly that." "You were raised to think beyond personal desires." His gaze shifted toward Eleanor. When he spoke again, his voice carried a conviction she had never heard before. "That lesson has cost enough." The words struck with unexpected force. Even Eleanor felt the weight behind them. Beatrice's expression hardened. Without another word she turned and disappeared into the manor. Yet the confrontation was far from finished. The following morning the entire household gathered for breakfast. Several distinguished guests remained at Blackwood Manor following the winter social season. Noblemen discussed politics. Ladies exchanged carefully disguised gossip. Servants moved quietly among the tables carrying silver trays and steaming coffee. The atmosphere seemed ordinary. Only Alexander, Eleanor, and Beatrice understood the tension simmering beneath the surface. Eleanor entered the dining room with measured composure. Conversation softened as she took her seat. Alexander sat beside her. Not across from her. Beside her. The simple decision immediately attracted attention. Whispers began. Beatrice noticed every one of them. Throughout the meal she maintained a polite facade. She spoke of weather, travel, and estate matters. Yet beneath her pleasant tone lingered unmistakable hostility. Finally her patience broke. One guest mentioned Eleanor's charitable work among tenant families. A harmless observation. Beatrice responded with a faint smile. "Compassion is admirable," she said, "though perhaps less useful than fulfilling the responsibilities for which one was brought into this family." The words landed exactly as intended. Several guests lowered their eyes. Others pretended not to understand. Eleanor felt humiliation threaten once more. The familiar wound reopened. For months she had endured such moments. For months she had accepted them. This time something changed. A chair scraped sharply against the floor. The sound echoed through the room. Every conversation stopped. Alexander rose. Silence immediately followed. The Duke rarely displayed emotion publicly. The sight alone commanded attention. His gaze settled first upon his mother, then upon the assembled guests. When he spoke, every word carried absolute authority. "Lady Eleanor is not a servant in this house." The room remained frozen. "She is not an obligation." No one moved. No one breathed. Alexander stepped toward his wife. "She is the Duchess of Blackwood." The declaration thundered through the dining room more powerfully than any shouted argument. Shock spread across every face. Guests stared openly. Servants forgot their duties. Even Beatrice appeared momentarily speechless. Alexander continued. "She deserves the respect accorded to her title." His eyes shifted toward his mother. "And the respect owed to her character." Years of silence shattered within those words. Years of regret. Years of hesitation. Years of allowing others to define Eleanor's worth. All of it ended there. No one challenged him. No one dared. The authority in his voice left no room for debate. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, Eleanor felt seen. Not observed. Not judged. See. The distinction nearly stole her breath. Alexander extended a small velvet box toward her. Confusion flickered across her face. Slowly she accepted it. Inside rested a magnificent sapphire necklace surrounded by diamonds. The stones captured the morning light and scattered blue fire across the table. A collective gasp filled the room. Every guest recognized it instantly. The Blackwood sapphire. An heirloom reserved for the most cherished duchesses in family history. Eleanor looked up in astonishment. Alexander's expression softened. It belongs to you. Emotion threatened her composure. Not because of the necklace, because of what it represented. Public acknowledgement. Respect. Trust. The thing she had quietly longed for. The breakfast concluded shortly afterward, yet the story spread through the manor before noon. By evening it had likely traveled beyond the estate itself. Society would speak of little else for weeks. For once, Eleanor did not fear the gossip. Later that afternoon she wandered through the conservatory seeking a moment of solitude. Winter sunlight filtered through towering glass panels. Exotic flowers filled the air with delicate fragrance. The peaceful setting offered a welcome escape from the morning's upheaval. Footsteps approached behind her. She knew who it was before turning. Alexander stopped beside her. For a moment neither spoke. The silence felt entirely different now. Comfortable. Honest. At last he broke it. I spent years believing duty was enough. Eleanor listened quietly. I convinced myself that affection complicated life. A faint smile touched her lips. And now? His gaze remained fixed upon hers. Now I know I was wrong. The words settled gently between them. He stepped closer. Not enough to compromise propriety. Enough to change everything. I married because duty demanded it, he said softly. Yet somewhere between your tears and your courage, duty became admiration. Eleanor's heartbeat quickened. His voice lowered further. And admiration became something I can no longer conceal. The confession stole the remaining distance between them. Months of loneliness seemed to dissolve beneath the warmth of that moment. For the first time, hope felt dangerous, because it finally felt real. Then the conservatory doors opened. A servant entered carrying urgent news. The physician has arrived, Your Grace. Alexander frowned slightly. Neither expected visitors. The servant hesitated. He insists the matter cannot wait. A strange unease settled over the room. The physician rarely came without reason. And as Eleanor watched the concern darken Alexander's expression, she sensed that whatever news awaited them was about to alter the course of both their lives forever. The conservatory seemed suddenly smaller after the servant's announcement. Only moments earlier, sunlight filtering through the glass had painted the flowers with warmth and promise. Now a strange anticipation settled over the room. Alexander exchanged a glance with Eleanor before motioning for the physician to be shown inside. Neither spoke. Both sensed that whatever message had prompted such urgency would not be ordinary. Moments later, Dr. Whitmore entered. The elderly physician had served the Blackwood family for decades. His calm demeanor rarely wavered, and his presence generally brought reassurance rather than alarm. Yet today his expression carried unusual gravity. He bowed respectfully. Your Grace, Duchess. Alexander stepped forward. You requested an immediate audience. I did. The physician's gaze shifted toward Eleanor. A gentle smile softened his features. Then he delivered the words that changed everything. Congratulations, Your Grace. The Duchess is expecting a child. Silence followed. Not the uncomfortable silence that had once plagued Blackwood Manor. A stunned silence. The kind that arrives when fate suddenly alters its course. Eleanor felt the room sway slightly around her. Her hand instinctively moved to her abdomen. For several heartbeats she could only stare. Alexander looked equally astonished. The physician continued explaining his findings, speaking of health and precautions, but his voice faded into the background. One truth eclipsed everything else. A child. An heir. The very thing that had defined Eleanor's worth in the eyes of others from the moment she entered Blackwood Manor. The realization struck her with unexpected force. Months earlier she might have welcomed the news without hesitation. Now a painful uncertainty accompanied it. The physician eventually departed, leaving husband and wife alone beneath the towering glass ceiling. The flowers seemed brighter. The world seemed different. Yet Eleanor's happiness remained tangled with fear. Alexander noticed immediately. He stepped closer. Instead of joy, he found tears gathering in her eyes. Concern darkened his expression. Eleanor. She lowered her gaze. For a moment she struggled to find words. When they finally came, they emerged almost as a whisper. What if nothing has truly changed? Alexander frowned. What do you mean? Her voice trembled. What if your mother was right all along? Pain flickered across her features. What if I truly was brought here only for this? The question cut deeper than either expected. Months of humiliation had left scars that affection alone could not instantly erase. The old wound remained. The belief that she was valued only for what she could provide rather than who she was. Alexander felt shame tighten within his chest. He understood why she doubted. He understood because he had allowed those doubts to grow. His silence had nurtured them. His hesitation had fed them. Not anymore. He gently lifted her chin. Eleanor. She met his gaze. I cannot erase what you endured. His voice carried quiet conviction. But I can tell you the truth. The sincerity in his eyes made it impossible to look away. The truth is that this child is a blessing. His hand found hers. But you were already precious to me before either of us knew this child existed. Emotion shimmered within her eyes. For the first time she believed he truly meant it. Yet one final battle remained. Not with society. Not with gossip. With the shadow that had ruled Blackwood Manor for years. Beatrice Blackwood. The news spread quickly through the estate. By evening, every servant knew. By morning, every guest knew. The arrival of an heir should have been a moment of uncomplicated celebration. Instead it exposed old wounds. When Beatrice learned the truth, satisfaction briefly crossed her face. For years she had demanded precisely this outcome. Yet the reaction she witnessed from her son unsettled her. Alexander's joy centered entirely upon Eleanor. Not the inheritance. Not the continuation of the family line. Eleanor. That distinction forced Beatrice to confront something she had spent months ignoring. Perhaps she had misjudged the situation. Perhaps she had misjudged the young woman herself. Alexander made a decision 2 days later. He summoned the household. Guests gathered in the grand drawing room. Servants lined the walls. Members of the Blackwood family arrived from neighboring estates. The atmosphere buzzed with curiosity. No one knew why the Duke had requested such a gathering. Only Eleanor sensed what was coming. Alexander stood before the fireplace. Tall, composed, certain. The room gradually fell silent. His gaze moved across the assembled faces before settling upon Eleanor. She stood beside him. Not behind him. Beside him. Exactly where she belonged. When he began speaking, his voice carried effortlessly through the room. Many of you have recently learned that my wife and I are expecting a child. Smiles appeared. Polite congratulations followed. Alexander waited for silence again. For years he had hidden behind restraint. Now he abandoned it completely. Long before I knew of this child, Lady Eleanor transformed this house. The words immediately captured everyone's attention. She endured hardship with grace. Eleanor felt tears threatening already. She answered cruelty with dignity. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. They knew exactly who he met. She brought compassion where pride once ruled. The room remained silent. Every person listened. Alexander took a slow breath. Then he continued. There is something more important that must also be said. The room grew still. His eyes never left Eleanor. Then delivered the truth he should have spoken months earlier. If fate had granted us no heir at all, I would still choose her. Emotion broke across Eleanor's face. His voice remained steady. I would choose her every day. The room disappeared around her. Only Alexander remained. Every season. His eyes softened. Every year heaven allowed. The final words shattered the last barriers surrounding her heart. Tears slipped freely down her cheeks. Not from sorrow. Not from humiliation. From relief. The kind of relief that arrives after carrying loneliness for far too long. The applause began slowly. Then spread throughout the room. Even servants joined. Many wiped discreet tears from their eyes. 4 months they had witnessed Eleanor's suffering. Now they witnessed her triumph. Yet the most unexpected moment came next. Beatrice rose from her chair. Every conversation stopped immediately. The Dowager Duchess approached Eleanor. No one could predict what would happen. Least of all Eleanor herself. For a long moment, Beatrice simply looked at her. Pride battled regret within her expression. At last regret won. I was wrong. The admission seemed almost impossible. The room remained frozen. Beatrice's voice softened. I believed strength came from preserving a family name. Her eyes glistened faintly. You taught me that true strength comes from preserving the people who carry it. The apology was imperfect, awkward, difficult, yet sincere. For Beatrice Blackwood it was monumental. Eleanor responded not with bitterness but grace. The same grace that had carried her through every trial. Months later spring arrived. The transformation of Blackwood Manor mirrored the transformation within its walls. The gardens exploded with color. Rose bushes overflowed with blossoms. Sunlight replaced winter shadows. Laughter replaced whispers. Fear no longer lingered in every corridor. Eleanor walked beneath flowering arches with one hand resting gently upon her growing belly. Alexander remained beside her. Always beside her. The child they awaited had become a symbol of hope, but it was not the foundation of their happiness. Love was. Mutual respect was. The hard-earned understanding forged through suffering was. As church bells drifted across the countryside, Alexander paused beside a bed of white roses. The same flowers that had once appeared mysteriously outside her door. He reached for her hand. She smiled. This time without hesitation. Without doubt. Without fear. Above them, petals danced upon the spring breeze. The heavens that had witnessed her humiliation now witnessed something infinitely greater. A woman once told she existed only for work and an heir had become the heart of Blackwood Manor. And as Alexander placed a protective hand over hers and their unborn child, the House of Blackwood entered a new chapter not defined by duty, status, or inheritance, but by the courage of a duchess who refused to let cruelty decide her worth, and by the love of a duke who finally found the strength to speak before silence could steal another precious thing from his life. Together they walked forward beneath the blooming roses, leaving behind the shadows of winter and stepping into a future neither title nor tradition could ever make more beautiful.